1942, the Pacific Ocean. US bombers took off from the aircraft carrier Hornet. Their mission, to launch World War II's first bombing raid on Japan. The raid was led by one of America's most celebrated pilots, Colonel James Doolittle, known for his courage, skill, and daring. If the raid were to succeed, it would be the first major blow to Japan's supremacy in the Pacific. But it was a huge gamble. The planes were not designed to take off from a carrier. To reach Japan, they'd have to fly at the very limit of their fuel capacity. Not all the crew would make it home. But those that did would bring back a story of one of the great narrow escapes of World War II. Winter 1941. America was at peace. The country and its people were hardly touched by the war raging across much of the world. But all this changed on December the 7th. That morning, the Japanese bombed the US naval base at Pearl Harbor on Hawaii. The American Pacific Fleet was severely damaged. America was shocked and humiliated. Carol Glines is a former pilot and expert on the period.
The attack was such a surprise. There were ships sunk in the harbor and hundreds of men were killed. I think the total was about 2,400 men killed and hundreds injured. It was such a shock that we couldn't believe that it happened.
Yet even as America assessed the damage, Japan was chalking up further victories across Southeast Asia. Japanese troops have landed in Borneo, Timor, and New Guinea. They've captured the strategically important Pacific islands of Wake and Guam. They've chased US forces out of the Philippines. And they've pushed the British out of Malaya and Hong Kong. Richard Overy has written extensively about the Second World War.
To the Americans, who for a long time had just assumed that, the Pacific was really their sea, that they dominated it, this was an extraordinary shock, and they were watching their strategic position rolled up in a matter of weeks.
It was time for America to hit back. US President Franklin Roosevelt was under huge pressure to do something.
Something had to be done, and he wanted his generals and admirals to know that he wanted something to happen as fast as they could get it together.
The sense in America was, of outrage. We're going to do something with these people.
Roosevelt urged the military to bomb Japan. But that was not so easy. Japan is 3,000 miles from the nearest US military base, far beyond the reach of even the longest-range US bombers. The Japanese seemed untouchable. But then, an audacious plan emerged. Suppose a bomber could be transported to within striking distance of Japan on an aircraft carrier, and then used to mount a bombing raid on the Japanese mainland. it was an extraordinary idea. Carriers were designed to carry small fighters. Nobody had ever put a heavy bomber on one before. It was an idea that raised 1,000 questions. Was the flight deck long enough for a bomber to take off? Could bombers return and land on the carrier? And could the carrier get close enough to Japan without coming under attack? US commanders explored the possibilities. Some bombers were too small to carry a big enough bomb load. Others were much too big to fit on a carrier. But one might just work. The Mitchell B-25. It was a modern, medium-sized bomber. It was reliable and exceptionally tough. It was time to call on one of America's most celebrated flyers. Jimmy Doolittle was widely known for his skill and daring. Doolittle was the first person to fly across the United States in less than 24 hours. In 1925, he won the Schneider Trophy, a famous speed competition for float planes. He was the first man to take off, fly, and land an aircraft using only its instruments to guide him. And he was at the forefront of aviation technology.
He was the man who pioneered high-octane, 100-octane fuel, a breakthrough which was really critical later on for the Allied Air Forces.
It had made him a celebrated and fated aviator. But this was going to be something entirely new, even for him. March 1942. Doolittle assembled his team at Elgin Field, Florida. The men arrived with very different attitudes. Some were proud to be associated with such a famous flyer. One was Dick Coe.
It's very nice to know that you were flying with the best pilot in the world at that time.
Another was Bob Height.
Jimmy was a very special aviator. He just had more grit than anybody else that we knew of.
But Ed Saylor had never heard of Doolittle until now.
There was no heroics involved in that volunteering for a dangerous mission. I didn't know what I volunteered for.
What pulled these very different men together was a common commitment to the war effort.
It was a dangerous mission from which they might not return. Well, in those days, that was the way you thought. I'll go, let's go. And that was the attitude of most people.
But they faced a huge challenge. Nobody had ever attempted anything like this before. As the crews explored the possibilities of their B-25s, one problem emerged almost immediately. The aircraft could take off from a carrier, but it couldn't return and land on it.
There was no way a B-25 could come back to a carrier and make a safe landing.
The big difference was fighters were small and maneuverable. Their wings could be folded for easy storage. But bombers had fixed wings and were too big to be stowed below deck. If the raid was to work, the bombers wouldn't be able to return to the carrier. They'd have to fly on to the nearest friendly landing strip. But that was not as simple as it sounded. The plan was for the carrier to take the planes to within 400 miles of the Japanese mainland, fly to Tokyo, and then fly another 1,500 miles to China, the nearest place of safety. It was a total journey of around 2,000 miles, 700 more than the Mitchell was designed to fly. The aircraft would have to be substantially modified. Each plane would end up with an additional 225-gallon leak-proof rubber fuel tank in the top of the bomb bay. A second, collapsible 160-gallon tank in the crawlway above the bomb bay. And a third, 65-gallon tank in the lower gun turret, which would be topped up from 10 5-gallon cans carried in the rear compartment. The extra fuel would give the Mitchells a range of 2,400 miles, just enough to reach safety. But these changes added a new problem. As the modifications progressed, it was clear the planes were still going to be very heavy. They would be carrying 4 500-pound bombs. 3 were high explosive. The 4th was a bundle of incendiaries. The weight would be an additional challenge for the pilots. Could such a heavily laden aircraft be lifted off in the extremely short distance of a carrier deck? Tom Griffin remembers the problem vividly.
We were going to be overloaded with a ton of bombs and something like between 350 and 400 extra gallons of gas in each one of these planes. And this heavily loaded plane had to get up in the air in 400 feet. The pilot would simply have the yoke in his belly and full flaps, full throttles, and we'd go down the airway and the plane would waddle in the air. We had a couple where planes didn't quite get airborne and slipped in and damaged the planes, but other than that, nobody was hurt.
As the crews practiced, Doolittle told them almost nothing about the mission. All they knew was that it was important and dangerous. For 80 men, it would be the start of an adventure that would turn into a very narrow escape. Meanwhile, across Southeast Asia, the Japanese war machine continued on. Singapore fell to Japanese forces. 100,000 troops surrendered. Sumatra and Java were occupied. Burma was invaded and occupied. Australia seemed next in line. Time was running out. America needed to act fast. April the 1st, 1942. Doolittle's mission finally set sail aboard the U.S. carrier Hornet. The 16 B-25s were stored.
When those airplanes were parked and tied down so that they wouldn't rock in heavy seas and get damaged just being on the deck, and they filled up that deck.
Only now were the flight crews told about their mission.
The loudspeaker on the carrier came on and said, "This carrier is going to Japan, and we're going to bomb targets there." And a great cheer went up, and the sailors who were very unhappy about this assignment, they didn't know where their great carrier was going, but they had heard that we were going to go to Pearl Harbor and sit around there to protect Pearl Harbor. So this was a wonderful change of plans.
But what the men didn't know, as the Hornet sailed into the Pacific, a critical part of the plan was still not in place. The operation called for the B-25s to land at small airfields near the Chinese town of Chuchao. Here they'd refuel and fly on to China's wartime capital of Chongqing, where they'd be donated to the Chinese war effort. But large parts of China were occupied by the Japanese. The Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, was worried about provoking further Japanese attacks.
When the request for air bases was made, Chiang was very reluctant because he could immediately see what was going to happen. The Americans were going to use bases in eastern China, the Japanese were going to move south, occupy the bases, and he would lose yet more territory.
As the raiders headed off, the landing strips in China were still being argued over. Chiang's reluctance would become a major problem. Just how big would only emerge later. "12 days after setting out, the USS Hornet linked up with a second carrier, Enterprise, and an escort of cruisers and destroyers. Finally, as the fleet neared Japan, D-Day approached. It was set for April the 19th. But then, there was an emergency. Early on the morning of April the 18th, radar operators on Enterprise located 2 Japanese boats nearby. A message was flashed to Hornet. 2 enemy surface craft reported. At dawn, Enterprise sent up reconnaissance aircraft to check what was going on. They spotted a small patrol boat, then 2 more. They were clearly part of a Japanese early warning system.
They were all radio equipped, and so when they saw this carrier, they reported it. They didn't know whether it was American or Japanese, but they reported it because it was different than they'd ever seen.
The Americans opened fire. Nearly 1,000 shells rained down on the Japanese boats. One was sunk. But it was too late. The word had already got out. Admiral Bull Halsey, the naval commander of the mission, faced a dilemma. Steam on and risk being caught by the Japanese Navy, or launch the aircraft immediately, even though they were some 200 miles further from their target than planned. Halsey calculated it was too risky to delay.
Admiral Halsey decided we've got to get those airplanes up. The order was given, Army pilots, man your planes. And Doolittle said, we go.
It would mean the planes, already flying at the limit of their range, would now have to fly even further. It was a sober moment for the flyers. Ed Saylor had just got married. He wasn't sure they were going to come back alive.
I thought that we probably would not survive the mission. That I wouldn't. No, I didn't dwell on that. So it's not like in the movies. You just keep doing your job and you think about those things a little bit, but you don't dwell on them.
At 8 a.m., Halsey flashed another message to Hornet. Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command, good luck and God bless you. Doolittle, in the first B-25, took off at 8:20 a.m. Dick Cole was his co-pilot.
We revved the engines up to full power and put down full flap, and I held the throttles, and at that time the deck man would point, and you release the brakes, and away you go.
"30-foot waves had turned the carrier into a seesaw. The other aircraft followed at approximately 4-minute intervals.
It was rough. When the ship was down, the water would come up over the deck and made a slippery deck. And that was not easy. The Navy had put down mats sort of that would prevent skidding.
A man at the end of the deck with a flag timed the dips so the aircraft could take off when the deck was rising. Remarkably, there was only one casualty.
The last airplane was about to move in position and started its engines. A sailor from the airplane in front, the B-25 in front, slipped on the wet deck and was blown into the left propeller of the last airplane. And he took his arm off. Had to have an amputation right away.
And that was a sad scene there for a moment, but it had to be just a moment. They carried him off, pulled the plane up to its takeoff point, and went.
Once airborne, the pilots began to recalculate their flying distance and fuel capacity. Ted Lawson, the pilot of plane number 7, would later write one of the definitive accounts of the raid. It took some figuring, quick figuring, and the sums gave me a sudden emptiness in the stomach. We had burned the equivalent of 8 of our 5-gallon cans of gas during the warm-up and takeoff. 40 precious gallons gone before we were on our way. But there was no time to be afraid.
Everybody had a job or a position on the plane, and you were just busy. That's all I was doing, concentrating where we were. That was my job, and how to get to where we wanted to go.
Most of the planes were destined for Tokyo, but 4 would peel off to attack Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. In Tokyo that morning, by coincidence, there was an air raid practice, but most people ignored it. The Japanese regarded their city as immune from air attack. By midday, it was over, and the city had resumed its bustle. But at the same time, the US planes were arriving over the Japanese coast.
There was Japanese naval ships up and down the coast there, all battleships and everything else. And nobody fired a shot at us. And we were at 1,500 feet looking down. We were helpless. They could have shot us down very easy.
Half an hour later, the first planes arrived over Tokyo. The Japanese now mounted a token opposition. Dave Thatcher was in plane number 7.
And over Tokyo, we ran into quite a bit of anti-aircraft fire, but it wasn't very accurate. They hadn't had any practice yet, I guess.
They were manning their anti-aircraft towers and shooting us, and their shells were bursting in the streets, actually. They did probably as much damage as we did to the city.
As the US planes approached their targets, they climbed to 1,500 feet before dropping their bombs. The maneuver was designed to stop them being hit by their own bomb blasts. The first bombs fell at about 12:30 p.m. It took each plane a mere 30 seconds to drop its load.
We dropped our bombs and didn't hang around to see what the damage was.
Our target was the Nippon Steel factory in Tokyo.
Still, the Japanese resistance was only token.
Two looked like fighter planes were sitting there behind us, tailing us, following us, and they stayed there for a few minutes and then left. They sure didn't try to shoot us down.
In a matter of minutes, the raid was over. Only one Mitchell had suffered significant damage, an 8-inch tear in its fuselage. Soon the US raiders were heading for China and, they hoped, safety. But it was not to be. They couldn't know the toughest part of the mission was still in front of them. The planes left Tokyo along a pre-planned route designed to confuse the Japanese about their final destination.
Flew southwest along the coast of Japan. We didn't fly over land, but we kept it within sight until we finally reached the southern tip of Japan and then headed west to China.
Their destination at Chuchao was some 100 miles inland. But almost immediately, they hit a fuel-sapping headwind.
We figured at that time, when we started across the China Sea, we were going to run out of gas about 100 to 150 miles short of China. As we went across that part of the sea, we were looking for ships. Our plan was to ditch near a ship, and they would take us aboard. And if it was a friendly ship, we'd just sail off with them. If it was an enemy ship, we would pull out our 45s and take over and sail away. Those were you had to have some kind of a plan.
We tried to save fuel best we could. We adjusted the fuel-air mixture in the carburetor down as lean as we could and still get our power.
Then they had a stroke of luck.
We got a wonderful weather break. We got a tailwind across the China Sea of about 30 to 35 miles an hour. That was all we needed to reach the China coast.
But as they approached the Chinese coast, night set in and the weather deteriorated. More seriously, there were no signs of the promised airfield lights.
It was a storm, and we could hardly see our wingtips. All we could do was to fly into that storm until we ran out of gas.
It was time to prepare to bail out.
We said we'll fly in as far as we can, because that got us out of Japanese held territory. So we just waited till our engines quit, and then we bailed out.
When the time came to bail out, Doolittle gave the signal and wished everybody good luck.
It was a tremendous risk for each airplane and a tremendous decision, command decision for each pilot. Okay, fellas, we're low on fuel, we can't make it.
For all of the men except Doolittle, it would be their first ever parachute jump. Some of the crews didn't make landfall and ditched in the sea. The crew of plane number 7 had a particularly difficult time.
The pilot spotted a strip of beach, thought he could land on it, but sort of misjudged, I guess, and couldn't see very well, and we hit the water with our wheel down. I was knocked unconscious for a while, and the airplane was upside down, and the plexiglass on a turret had shattered, and that's where the water was coming in. So I was able to go back and the escape hatch on the bottom of the airplane. The other 4 of the crew were already up on the beach when I got up there, but they were very seriously injured.
It would later emerge that the Chinese end of the operation had been a fiasco. They were still working on the airstrips. None had been lit or fitted with homing beacons. In all, 13 crews bailed out over land and 2 ditched in the sea. The one remaining plane landed in neighboring Russia. Now, for each of the crew, began a desperate search for sanctuary. Doolittle landed on a dung heap and escaped unhurt. But he was convinced the mission had been a disaster. He later wrote, "I felt lower than a frog's posterior. This was my first combat mission. Planned it from the beginning and led it. I was sure it was my last."
He thought that the mission was a failure because he had lost all his airplanes.
One of the first problems the crews faced was linking up with each other. They devised a rudimentary means of communication.
We all had 45. You hear one shot, give 2 shots as an answer. I heard a shot, I gave 2 shots. In that mountainous territory, I think I heard 2 shots and I thought it came from here. So I headed that way, but it came from here. How we later figured it out, because we didn't get together for several days.
Yet even as they looked for each other, the Japanese were looking for them. Most of the raiders had landed near Japanese-held territory. There was a real risk they'd be picked up by Japanese patrols. It would turn into a game of cat and mouse. Some linked up with Chinese resistance fighters. They were guided across the country. Tom Griffin had met up with Doolittle's group.
The Chinese helped me and my crew back to a middle point in China, and gradually over the several days they got more of our crews back to that same point. The Japanese knew we were there, and they bombed that area every day.
But despite the Japanese bombardment, nobody was hurt. Doolittle and a small band of men were taken by land, and then by boat. En route, they had a stroke of luck. They ran into a Westerner. It was John Birch, an American missionary working in China. Doolittle would later write in his biography, he obviously knew his way around and could speak the language. I briefed him on our predicament and he agreed to join us, translate for us, and help us get on our way. With Birch's help, Doolittle and his crew were airlifted to the Chinese wartime capital at Chongqing. But many of the other raiders were still having a difficult time. Ed Saylor, the engineer gunner in Plane 15, had crashed in the sea. He couldn't swim.
You get splashed under by the waves and then surface again and spit out the salt water, look around, and after an hour or so we got on shore. Didn't feel a thing. I'm sure it was cold, but I didn't feel cold.
Nearby, Dave Thatcher in plane number 7 had also landed in the sea. He and his fellow crew members were having an even worse time.
The pilot had a deep gash in his arm and a very deep gash in his left leg. And the co-pilot had a gash in his arm. And the navigator was leaning against the armor-plated seats when it crashed, so he broke both shoulders.
The most seriously injured was the aircraft's captain, Ted Lawson, who had suffered serious head and leg injuries. But they too were later picked up by the Chinese resistance. Communication with them was difficult.
Making marks on the dirt floor, trying some words. We had learned how to say I'm an American in Chinese. So at that point they knew we were Americans.
Over the next few weeks, the injured raiders were moved from village to village.
We slowly made our way across China. No transportation.
At one point, they had to dive for cover from a Japanese patrol.
You see Japanese soldiers when they walked by and stuff. And there was a lot of yelling and talking. After a while, it quieted down, and so then we found out that they had tracked us because our shoes had heels, and the people who lived around there didn't have heels on it.
By now, Ted Lawson's leg was becoming seriously infected. Fortunately, after several days, the group arrived at a missionary hospital. Here, they ran into another survivor, the mission's doctor, Thomas White. Lawson will record, Doc White came into my room. He was very clean looking in his uniform, but he was uncomfortable. Neither of us said anything for a little while. I looked at him and asked him if he was going to take the leg. "Yeah, I think so," he said. in a makeshift operating theater. Doc White amputated Lawson's left leg. Ed Saylor heard about it firsthand.
The doctor really done a job there. There was no real anesthetic. They had a little morphine, and he used that, and with very crude implements, took his leg off right above the knee. I guess if the doctor hadn't have been there, he probably would have died.
Finally, weeks later, Lawson and his group were airlifted to Chongqing to join the rest of the raiders. They were among the last of 64 Doolittle raiders to reach the safety of the city. 16 were not so lucky. 3 died bailing out. 8 were captured by the Japanese. Only 4 of them were returned to the United States at the end of the war. One was Bob Hite.
We ran out of fuel and were actually trying to find our way in China. And the Japanese had the place surrounded. And they saw us and captured us. It wasn't a very happy time.
Finally, the 5 men who had landed near Vladivostok were held by the Russians. Despite Doolittle's fears, in America, the raid was declared an overwhelming success. All the raiders were honored. Doolittle was promoted to general and became a national hero. But for all the morale boost, the raid had a mixed outcome. In Japan, it was a psychological blow. But the physical damage was minor, and it did almost nothing to halt the Japanese war machine. It's in China that the real physical damage was done. Here, the Japanese wreaked a terrible revenge for the country's cooperation with America. 20,000 square miles of countryside were ravaged.
As Chiang Kai-shek had expected, of course, the Japanese acted. They thought the Chinese had been complicit. They were angry at what had happened. And they did what they'd done every time they punished the Chinese. They burnt villages down, they murdered the villagers, they stole all the crops and livestock. So the Chinese did pay quite a substantial price.
The figures are disputed, but on some estimates, several 100,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians were killed. The war in the Pacific would drag on for another 3 years. Until America dropped a much bigger bomb on Japan. In August 1945, Doolittle was taken to see the aftermath of the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. It was America's final victory in the Pacific, a victory that had started 3 years earlier with Doolittle's daring raid on Tokyo.